Hello and welcome to ABSC Monthly, a DevCentral podcast, featuring contributions from Aaron Brailsford.
That's why security made your job harder, right? Because stuff like this actually happens in the real world.
David Warburton.
So I think this would be a great example where you might lock something down. Make sure we kind of tell people why we're doing it, give them a very tangible reason, specifically if there's a kind of very recent news story. And I think that will then lead to a better appreciation and less kind of resistance and frustration when people look at the various IT policies they've got.
Malcolm Heath.
That's a really good point. There is a really strong contrast between the level of sophistication that was used to gain the initial job. Relatively sophisticated, right? And it got past everybody who interviewed this person. And then moreover, the job was, if I'm not mistaken, for some sort of a software engineering role.
Megazone.
It seems like they got caught and detected because they were ham-fisted. Like you got this new laptop, booted it up, when the first thing I started doing was loading up malware, like known malware that intrusion detection systems immediately tripped over.
And more. Strap on those earbuds and get ready for ABSC Monthly.
All right, and welcome to ABSC Monthly for July. I'm Aaron Brailsford, and with me this month we've got Malcolm Heath for F5 Labs, Dave Warburton from F5 Labs, and my colleague on the F5 Cert Megazone. Thanks for joining us.
Good to see you again, Aaron.
Good to see you guys, and good to see you here for the first time, MZ.
I'm the more this week.
You are the more, yeah. And for anybody who's met MZ, you'll know that is true in many senses because he's like 6'7". All right, why don't we start this month, before we get into our roundtable of news from the industry, a little bit of news from F5. We recently signed up to CISA's Secure by Design pledge. And MZ, I know that you and others on the F5 Cert were pivotal in making that happen. So do you want to tell us a little bit about who CISA are and about the pledge?
Sure. For those who aren't familiar, CISA is the U.S.'s cybersecurity and infrastructure security agency, CISA. Basically, they call themselves America's Cyber Defense Agency. So they put out a little over a year ago, I think, originated this they call Secure by Design pledge, designed for software vendors, product vendors to sign on to this. It's a voluntary pledge to 7 areas to make your products more secure. And we've looked at this for a while. We brought this up, and starting a few months ago, we got some traction with our leadership to get F5 to sign on to this pledge. Basically, it focuses on these different areas of product improvement or security improvements, such as introducing more multi-factor MFA use in your products, getting rid of default passwords, focusing on reducing classes of vulnerability. So, like, say you want to focus on removing XSSs or DOS or something, some type of class of vulnerability. Making it easier for customers to do security patches to get your constituents to patch their products faster. Having a vulnerability disclosure policy, which F5 already does, but there's always room to improve. Publishing CVEs, which F5 does also do through F5 Cert. And making it easier for people who do suffer from intrusions to gather evidence of the intrusions that affect the products. So these are the areas that are fall under the pledge. There's a lot more detail in the pledge itself, of course. Our CISO and see if I can find the article here. We have some signatures. Kara Sprague and Samir Sharif, I believe, if I pronounced the last name correctly, I hope, have created a blog post on our blog, a corporate blog, talking about F5 signing this and our commitment to this pledge. So it's just something, I think, to highlight our focus on product security and the kind of area the F5 Cert's active in. I'm actually the primary contact from the F5 Cert side to CISA for this pledge. There's regular meetings. We had one just this week. Started up between the different signatories to share technical information and things. So looking forward over the next year, we'll continue to make more security improvements.
Cool. Thanks, MZ. Yeah, just looking at the CISA's website there, we're in in good company. There's 198 companies have signed the pledge now. Many of competitors and companies in a similar space, Palo Alto, but also Microsoft, HP. It's a long list of people, and some really good aims, I think.
Yeah, and the goal isn't perfection, right? Perfect is the enemy of good, but it's continuous improvement. It's basically just saying these are areas we're going to focus on, and we're making the pledge to try to improve things.
Yeah, I think that's, I've been very impressed with the activities of the CISA since it really kind of came on the scene a couple of years ago, I think. They are also the people behind the Known Exploited Vulnerabilities database, and several other initiatives. And they provide a lot of training and a lot of assistance to companies either that are trying to improve things or who have been the subject of a breach. So really, I don't have anything bad to say about them, which given their relatively small budget for a government institution, they've been doing really, really great work.
Yeah, I actually work with people from there all the time because I'm very active in the CVE org group. I'm the CNA liaison to the board, and I'm on a lot of working groups. CISA has a number of people who are on the working groups. The head of one, we could now rename to the co-op or for the CNAs, is led by somebody, Todd from CISA. So I work with people who are there all the time. They've been really great people. And also the F5 Cert, when we do our quarterly QSNs, like we do a briefing with them every time we do a QSN to let them know what's going on. And they've always been great to work with.
I would agree. From my perspective, when we've interacted with them, they're a great partner to work with. And those goals, like you say, MZ, F5 has already accomplished, I would say, at least 2 of those goals, if not more. And they are all things that should make a massive difference to the industry if everybody tackles them in some kind of standardized way. Just implementing multi-factor auth everywhere, right? We've got some news articles later where we'll talk about multi-factor auth, but anything is better than nothing. So any kind of MFA on every login, it would be a good start.
I think what's interesting from my point of view is, although CISA is a US organization, you have things like GDPR, which is EU focused, but because there's such kind of broad sweeping kind of legislations or kind of policies, when you get large kind of global multinational companies sign up to them, everyone across the world benefits. So really great to see. Yeah,
that's a very good point. There's a lot of alignment, I think, between the aims of legislation around the world, even if the language is different. So if we at least if everybody moves towards a place of improvement, it can only help.
I mean, I think that will be the one kind of remaining, complex kind of thing for policy enforcers, people within organizations, whether it's vendors, whether it's, organizations looking to implement or make sure they're adhering to policies is, whilst these kind of policies are great and they often apply to kind of they have a global remit because organizations might be headquartered in one country, but they operate in many different regions. It's just keeping track of all of them. And they might be very similar, but you need to be absolutely certain that, your policies are compliant to every single separate one to make sure you're not out of compliance for any one particular kind of jurisdiction or piece of legislation.
That is a good point. That's the whole, governance, risk, and compliance is a really complicated part of the business to be in. It's not one I'd want to be trying to make sure that we're compliant with worldwide, for sure.
Yeah, I think voluntary pledges like this too, and so it's one of those things. I think if the industry moves in this direction and works on improvement, to be a little self-serving, you either do it voluntarily or eventually someone's going to tell you to do it, right? So it's like this is pledges like this and voluntary efforts to make improvements and make a real effort. I think also help avoid more heavy-handed approaches of legislation or regulation of telling you will do this, because that also reduces flexibility and innovation. if you end up mandating a certain approach to security, and maybe that's not the right approach in the end, right?
Yeah, and I think it kind of sets the right kind of tone, I think, and the right kind of attitude within organizations. I think if you're having to imply or create new policies just to meet legislation, typically you're going to do the minimum effort. It's going to be a tick box exercise. Whereas being proactive, it's setting the right mindset, it's showing proactivity, and hopefully, again, setting the right mindset across the entire business, and not just making sure you're reaching that one piece of legislation.
Yeah, and I expect something like this pledge to evolve too, because if you have these 7 goals, and it's going to be continuous improvement, but at some point, I'm sure the goals will shift because they'll be like, oh, the industry in general is doing a really good job on this. Maybe we get everybody publishing CVE, so that isn't a goal anymore. That's just steady state. So you come up with new goals, because the one thing is job security is there never seems to be an end to the problems to solve. So. There's always going to be new goals to achieve and new things to focus on. I think this just helps people focus on some achievable areas to start making those improvements.
Cool. This all sounds like positive stuff. So now we can talk about the less positive stuff, which is usually the news from the last month, which one way or another all seems to involve stuff being, I was going to say everything involves the risk of breach in some way. I think that's probably true looking at the topics. So the first up, I've got KnowBe4. They have some good training materials for your internal employees on cybersecurity topics. So, things like avoiding becoming a victim of phishing attacks, that kind of thing. But this month, they published an incident report summary, but they hired someone who they thought was a US employee who turned out to be a North Korean person posing as a US employee. And I mean, this stuck out to me because this is exactly the kind of thing they produce training on. And I mean, it proves that everybody is fallible, right? Nobody is perfect. I don't know if any of you read this and had any thoughts.
Yeah, I think the one thing that kind of got me, I mean, to your point, Aaron, everyone makes mistakes, and I think it's how you respond. That's the most important thing. And we've got some great examples in the news, some of which we're not covering today, where maybe the response from organizations hasn't been kind of great. I think to be fair to KnowBe4, despite them maybe knowing after and not before the case, sorry for the bad joke, they were very kind of proactive with it. They kind of, they talked about it and kind of shared as many details as they could. For me, the kind of the thing I thought was interesting was this kind of malicious actor was based in North Korea. But the reason it wasn't immediately obvious is the laptop. I mean, everyone's working remotely now, so it's very common for laptops and devices to be shipped directly to people's home, ready for the first day at work. And it was shipped to, I believe, a place in the United States. And it wasn't caught because all that happened was it was shipped to essentially like a mule, basically someone that was in on the act that actually was living in the United States. They booted up a laptop from a US location with a US IP address. And then this threat actor from North Korea actually VPN'd in to the device to then start deploying the malware. So I thought that was quite an interesting bit of information that, had it been, connectivity directly from a North Korean IP address, very obvious kind of initial red flag. But obviously they thought they were doing a good job to kind of cover their tracks. And it was only the EDR software that started detecting all the malware being deployed.
Yeah, it makes me wonder, reading the stories on this, it seems like they got caught and detected because they were ham-fisted. Like they got this new laptop and booted it up when the first thing I started doing was loading up malware, like known malware that intrusion detection systems immediately tripped over. Had they been a lot more subtle about it, it started up acting like an employee, worked for a bit, built some rep, and then used their access internally to put better targeted malware on internal systems that could have flown under the radar. Which makes you wonder, is this happening, right? And it would surprise me if this is happening in other locations. This just seemed really like amateur hour approach. They did a lot of sophisticated work to do the faking and get into the door. Then he walked in the door and shouted that they were here to hack things.
That's a really good point. There's a really strong contrast between the level of sophistication that was used to gain the initial job, which included deepfake videos, relatively sophisticated, right? And it got past everybody who interviewed this person. And then moreover, the job was, if I'm not mistaken, for some sort of a software engineering role. So that person may very well have, would have ended up with relatively elevated access or, a positioning within the company that would have allowed them to do all sorts of clever things. And stay under the radar. So I wonder about the division of labor and the infrastructure on within the organization that was doing this, whether it was they have sophisticated people doing sophisticated things to get people jobs, and then they handed it off to a junior operator who, as you say, became very obviously a threat. So there may be some discussions about how the correct procedures, TTP should be done back in North Korea. Maybe I don't know.
I think it's. We've got to credit KnowBe4 for kind of sharing the story. They could have kept it quiet and not wanted to get themselves in the news. But actually, it's having this kind of story is useful for everybody. The more we share in the industry, the more everyone benefits. It is a bit unfortunate. There are multiple levels of irony in it. The fact that many of us within F5 have just completed our deepfake training from KnowBe4, I believe. And the fact that this role was for an internal IT AI team, which clearly was used to augment and change the image of the supposed hire to make it look a bit like someone else. So, but again, kind of jokes and poking fun aside, we've got to credit KnowBe4 for sharing the story.
I totally. I think that's. I have a little catchphrase that I've used in other articles and things, is where our customers can't make informed decisions if we don't inform them. I believe a big part of cybersecurity is sharing these kind of incidents, because one, it shows it does happen to everybody, and it can happen to anybody. If you think you're impervious, so that would never happen to me, my network, you're probably setting yourself up. And sharing how these things happen and how things got passed is how the industry learns. That's if we share information with each other and we share these incidents, everybody else knows, that's something maybe I hadn't thought of. I'm sure it's caught a lot of people off guard. Never thought of someone would fake a job application. I'm sure a lot of people were surprised about this. We've seen similar things in the past, but we've even speculated about this kind of thing in the past in some of our discussions. But to see this as real world evidence, this is definitely happening. It's kind of interesting.
Yeah, one of the risks in here that I hadn't really considered was remoting into the machine that was delivered to you.
Yeah.
Now, that's something that I know quite a lot of people, at least in our industry, do when they're delivered let's say you get a Windows machine, you really love Linux. So you work on your Linux box and you remote into your Windows machine to do the corporate things that you have to do on the Windows machine.
Right.
And people don't like it when that kind of access goes away, right? It's why is security trying to make my job harder? But actually writing about the real world attacks like this, this is a real world example where that's why security made your job harder, right? Because stuff like this actually happens in the real world.
I think it's a good point. I think, I can think of probably half a dozen examples where I work in the security industry and I still get frustrated with the fact I can't do certain things on my laptop. And I think actually, I've always kind of thought, if you not just tell people to be out on the lookout for this attack and this vulnerability, but explain why, give them examples. And I think this would be a great example where, you might lock something down, make sure we kind of tell people why we're doing it, give them a very tangible reason, specifically if there's a kind of very recent news story. And I think that will then lead to a better appreciation and less kind of resistance and frustration when people look at the various IT policies they've got. Agreed.
Especially when you're dealing with highly technical people. We I'm just going to speak for everybody here. I don't think any of us particularly like being told what to do. We're very technical. We think we know lots of stuff about lots of stuff. We're like, well, let me do my own thing. I know the risks. Mm-hmm. Sometimes we need to be reminded that there are risks that we have not considered. The other thing that caught my eye in KnowBe4's write-up of this was that somehow they know that he apparently used a Raspberry Pi to download the malware, which I thought was a weird detail to have when they presumably have no access to the laptop farm that all of this.
Do you know what the angle was, or the exact method they did? That was a Raspberry Pi kind of local to this laptop to grab from. Was the Raspberry Pi hosted somewhere else on the internet?
Yeah, I would assume that this Raspberry Pi was sitting in the laptop farm, where all the equipment was shipped to. But they don't say, and I haven't seen any other details on that.
I wonder if, because it's not uncommon for people to lock down, I immediately think, why not just load a USB stick with malware on there? But of course, many more stringent security policies will lock down USB access. Whereas, accessing a web page on a local Raspberry Pi on the local network probably isn't blocked. I'm sure it wouldn't be. So that might be a reason they went that approach.
That's a very good point. Yeah, we have certain classes of USB devices are banned here, right, in F5. Yep. Exactly that reason.
Yep.
Mm-hmm. That's a very good point.
I think, that's one of the things that you mentioned earlier, those things like, why does security do this? It's frustrating, right? I mean, I didn't find that frustrating because I would do things like, if I'm traveling for work, whatever, I'd sometimes side those things under my Kindle or something, right? Just to have it in. You can't, because F5 has disabled any kind of mass storage over USB. And so you learn to live with it, but it's one of those kind of, it's functionality for a decade and now it's gone. But I understand from the security side of things why that was done. You stop people from sticking USB sticks in their laptops and getting infected or moving customer data or anything protected data onto a USB stick.
I mean, it makes you wonder, though, if you kind of look another year or 2, 5 years in the future, just how many more policies we'll have and just how much more lockdown our devices is going to be. And at what point do we kind of end up with quite dumb tablets that can't do much? They're going to lock, potentially come with kind of lockdown local network access and then this and that and various policies. So it's difficult, though, because, just how many different ways, how many different threat vectors and attack vectors are there to get onto a device and compromise. So it's not an enviable position to be in that kind of security team where you're defining these policies and having to restrict so much access for your employees.
I just have to say, having been in the industry a long time and having actually worked for companies a long time ago who made these devices, that we may see a return to thin clients.
Yeah, I was about to joke that the network is the computer, right? Yeah. So this whole thing.
Yeah. There's a bunch of advantages with that. I mean, you have essentially no local storage. You have it's essentially just a terminal to display. Probably these days connected to a virtual machine running on the corporate network. It can really reduce the attack surface a significant amount, and have always on a VPN and a whole bunch of other things. So. Other than the fact that we're all super attached to the idea of basically carrying our computers around with us, I think some companies may actually be able to justify the idea of just being like, here's your dumb terminal, plug it into your home network. Okay, you're good to go. Sorry, you don't get to access work resources when you're on the road. So, yeah.
Yeah, well, I think all of us sitting here have been around for a while, so we remember, BT220 terminals then Wise Win terms that in the early days of Windows NT. And as a friend of mine who ex-F5er, and where he works now, they ship him a very expensive MacBook, right? Give him his hybrid. So when he's at home, he has this very expensive MacBook. When he's in the office, he has his very expensive MacBook. And basically all he uses it to do is remote into a secure system to do his work.
Yeah.
So he has a very expensive thin client sitting on his desk.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. I just wanted to mention one last thing before we maybe move on, which is I had a really interesting point the other day, which another vector, if you like, that I hadn't really considered is, and anyway, moving on, which is many of us use kind of browsers now, and all these browsers, you can sign into the browser and you sync stuff. You might even sync cookies, certainly bookmarks, credentials. So actually, it's not uncommon for people to use personal devices, sign into the browser, and actually have corporate credentials and corporate bookmarks and cookies, and maybe not cookies, but those kind of things being synchronized onto personal machines. So that could be another place where you kind of end up with another policy in the future where even on corporate devices, we're going to be told exactly what browser to use, and we're blocked from kind of logging in, blocked from synchronizing, and everything will have to be far more manual again.
Yeah,
I am endlessly surprised that we can still use browser of our choice. You make a good point, and everybody listening should be careful about what credentials they store in those browsers. Like Google, for me, Google Chrome is my password manager, right? Yeah. And because I'm lazy, but yeah, if you store your Active Directory credentials in a password manager or in Google Chrome and it's ever breached, well, now you've just given away access to a corporate system.
Yeah, everyone's typing your Google account now, Aaron.
Yeah, pretty much. I should probably check the password on that, shouldn't I? Well, it's all right because I have two-factor auth. Speaking of two-factor auth, we'll just quickly blow through this article because I thought it's a small article that is scant on detail, but is really a big move that Singaporean banks are being mandated to phase out one-time passcodes for online logins within the next 3 months, which is an incredibly short time span. I think most people know that banking, at least in Europe and probably the US, moves very slowly. Banks are slow to adopt anything. So the idea of giving an entire country's banks 3 months to do anything is amazing to me. But they are mandating a move away from one-time passcodes and to what the article describes as a digital token. Like I say, it's light on detail on what the digital token is. But, I know that Labs, you guys have written about phishing proxies and the risks of two-factor auth previously. So any brief thoughts on this one?
Yeah, we've written quite a lot about this. It was previous Labs researcher, Sean, I think, wrote one of the first articles that we had on what we call real-time phishing proxies. We frequently talk about the circumvention of multi-factor authentication. We had a new bit of malware we discovered a few years ago whereby primarily Android devices were being compromised, and it was a bit of an info stealer. So they were grabbing cookies, grabbing tokens, and able to intercept one-time passwords. I think it's generally been recognized for a long time that things like most one-time passwords, I'm going to assume here that they're referring to either emailed or SMS-based one-time passwords. That's certainly the most common and typically one of the most easy multi-factor authentications to set up. We've spoken about the numerous ways they can be intercepted, whether it's malware on the device, other kind of phishing mules. But I think it's interesting, they talk about using digital tokens. Again, I'm going to assume that they mean the kind of crypto-based rotating tokens of the likes of Google Authenticator and I use Authy, cross-platform device. But when it comes to real-time phishing proxies, actually those rotating tokens are actually just as vulnerable because the whole point is that the attacker is essentially sitting there in real time and replaying that token while it's still valid for the 30 to 60 seconds it's still valid. So I think it's definitely a step in the right direction. I think, those rotating crypto-based codes are more secure. But again, I've spoken about this before. I think it's really important for people organizations and users to just be aware of the limitations because we see so many different ways that MFA is being intercepted and bypassed. Doesn't mean we shouldn't be doing it. Absolutely raises the bar. But certainly not infallible. But yeah, it would be interesting to get a few more details on this story.
Yeah.
Sorry. Go ahead, Aaron.
No, go on, Mike.
I was just going to say, there's so many different ways to do MFA. SMS, various authenticators, YubiKeys, hardware tokens. There's even device certificates, can play a role in this sort of thing. And my hope is that the Singapore banking industry is going to what is considered industry standard, right, for this application, which would be something compliant with FIDO2. And that does essentially eliminate the risk of real-time phishing proxies. So it doesn't necessarily entirely get away from device-based risks, like, it's possible that there might be some malware that could, essentially be intercepting traffic even after you're authenticated, and recording what you do, or otherwise manipulating queries that you're making, sort of at the device level. But it is the current best way to do it. So I'm hoping they're adopting best practices. Unfortunately, the articles that we were looking at weren't, like you say, David, very deep in the technical details. But given the fact that all of my banking institutions in the U.S. Use email codes or SMS codes, I can't help but just be like, why aren't we doing the same? So.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I wish that my banks did two-factor, multi-factor at all for the most part. Most of mine don't. Yeah. I occasionally get challenged, especially if I'm buying things. I do a lot of auction sites in the UK or EU. Then they'll be like, "Oh, you're doing something weird outside of your own territory. Well, go get this. So we'll email you a code so we can authorize this purchase." But most of the time, when I'm doing stuff in the US, they're kind of like, "Oh, whatever you want to do, go ahead. I don't care. Just log in with a password."
I think what scares me the most is whether it's kind of email-based SMS, or there's so many sites now are going to like email-based logins. Like they don't even give you a password. Yeah. Every time you log in, they'll send you a link, and it just means that like email is becoming it's the gates to your entire digital life potentially. It means like if you don't secure that thing, then everything is fair game.
Absolutely. And, we've written extensively about business email compromise in the past as well, right? So if you hinge absolutely everything off of access to an email, and that email account is not extremely well defended, you're really asking for sort of mass compromise of all of your accounts right there, right? So it's a bad idea.
It is your single point of failure.
Right.
Yeah.
Speaking of single points of failure, last week, yes, there was a somewhat global single point of failure for millions of computer systems worldwide when CrowdStrike had a slight snafu. I think it's fair to say. We can't really have July's news without talking about CrowdStrike in some way, even if we don't have a huge amount of time to talk about it. I think we can talk about it for weeks. But the short version of this, right, was that CrowdStrike pushed out an update to their EDR engine, and that update went out to millions of machines around the world. It was broken and caused many to blue screen and get stuck in an endless loop of rebooting and blue screen of death. I'm sure everybody on this call has got some thoughts about that one.
Yeah, I've been doing a lot of reading about this. I'm working on, it's my turn for as this is being recorded, it's my turn to write our This Week in Security article. And so this CrowdStrike obviously was the thing. The update they pushed out, the bad update, was live, they say, for only 78 minutes. So that bad file was available to update systems for 78 minutes, and in those 78 minutes, they managed to take down most of the globe. So that was very efficient. But yeah, I said lots of people going like, "You're ridiculous. Why was this allowed to live update systems?" This is the trade-off. Because of the type of system it was and the type of update, they were basically updating the detection for abuse of, I believe it was named pipes, and figures off the top of my head from memory. And these are updates that get pushed out when they see bad behaviors throughout their sensor network. They try to vaccinate other systems by going, "Oh, hey, we're seeing this new behavior over here. Let's push this update out rapidly to everybody so that nobody else gets compromised before it's real-time updates." So the whole idea of, you have to have you should never do update this kind of in production. You have to have a staging network and do all the testing. This is exactly the kind of thing that if you did that, you delay protecting your active systems. That was a trade-off. All these companies had to make was, I allow this update to be done real time without going through staging and all, because it's designed to protect me against real time threats. If I put it for my staging environment for a week, then that's useless. Like by the time it gets pushed out there, the threat will have moved on, and I'll either be owned or I won't be. So that's the the kind of damned if you, damned if you don't thing is, do you allow updates, like live updates from a third party to your production systems, or do you sacrifice timeliness and defense? And that's a difficult choice.
And there's another trade-off in this as well that I thought was really interesting. But it's very similar to what you just described, MZ. I mean, the level of access that CrowdStrike had at a system, on the systems,
kernel level,
was at kernel level, or perhaps even past that, and that's necessary for these sort of systems, because there are threats and exploits and vulnerabilities that can only be detected and stopped at that level. Right now, those are probably uncommon, but they do exist. So if you have a very high level of if you're worried about very sophisticated actors coming after you and you need real-time protection, then I don't see any way that you can avoid running security software that is in a position to be able to defend against those threats.
Right.
But then you are essentially saying, this is a tool that I'm running in my environment that if something goes wrong, will crater a lot of machines, right? So I honestly don't know what the right choice is here.
Well, I think it's interesting. It raises an interesting point. I certainly don't know the answer, which is, obviously there's so many pictures and videos of frontline systems, digital billboards, ticket systems, kiosk machines that had this issue. And it just makes me wonder, just discussing the fact that, we need this kind of real-time updates, immediate things we push out. Should those devices on the very front line, should those devices be, in a position where they need those kind of updates? Why do ticket systems, kiosk systems, why are they in such a position that they need the absolute latest kind of real-time updates? Should they not be segmented, air-gapped, or have some other kind of system that means they don't need the very, very latest, minute-by-minute kind of updates?
That's a really good point, and I think maybe that is the answer, is some kind of a distinction in levels of protection, perhaps, where your absolutely critical systems, your core systems, may very well have this sort of level of real-time protection and deep system access. But for a network of kiosks that are mostly just fetching data from an API or something, wouldn't it make more sense to maybe just have a way of re-imaging those rapidly or respawning them, and not treating them as if they are the crown jewels? I mean, that wouldn't necessarily have made much of a difference here, because even if it was just your core systems that you were protecting in this way, your core systems still probably would have gone down.
Absolutely.
But maybe there's some ways to segment our architectures in such a way that we reduce the risk of a single point of failure from a necessary security tool. I've seen some articles touching on, there's going to be a lot of forensics and analysis of this coming. It's just happened in the past week. There's a lot. The early analysis right now is really early days, but some of it is Linux and Mac systems weren't taken down in the same way Windows systems were, and a lot of the early things I've been looking at is some of that is because of the way the architecture on Windows was done, where to give third parties access to do this kind of thing on Windows, Microsoft basically designed things to just give them that level of raw kind of kernel level access to things, and not, say, put together a security API or something where these tools could access data without running in that environment where they could step on things. And this looks like it was kind of a memory error, memory handling error, classic. And so could this be that we also need to make sure that, could this be an improvement from the Microsoft side of improve the way Windows allows? Yes, do you need these kind of protections? But there might be better ways of doing it than just, sure, go ahead and play in the kernel memory. So this is really interesting, because there was an article or an interview in, I believe, the Wall Street Journal, where a Microsoft spokesman actually was sort of hinting
the EU
that the EU regulations that Microsoft signed on to was what required them to give companies like CrowdStrike access to the highly restricted security APIs that Microsoft's own security products use that give this level of access. So, I mean, this is going to have impacts not only in the security world, but also in, talk about issues about regulation, about anti-competitive practices, about monopolies, about a whole bunch of things. And moreover, I will just point out that from what I understand, there was a similar issue with CrowdStrike on Linux that happened to maybe like a week before or something like that. But it was pretty constrained and it only affected one kernel version. That was like a rev behind the most current one, and it was handled relatively easily, and it was also not as impactful, right, globally. So, yeah, it's not just Microsoft here. I think that there's a discussion to be had about the risks posed by security products, right? That is going to take quite a long time and a lot of discussion to sort of figure out, because we need them, but also we can't just be knocking down 8.6 million machines and grounding flights around the world, amongst other things, right?
I've also seen a lot of people writing the whole monoculture. This is like why you don't grow one crop, right? And that, but it's a lot. The real world's a lot more complex than that. You can't just say, "Oh, we should have diversity we should have 1,000 different operating systems or something," right? I think there are benefits to having focused security on a small number of platforms than instead of trying to secure 1,000 different platforms. So this is a very complex issue. There are no simple answers. So all the people out there throwing out, all you have to do is type answer to this.
No, it's never that. It's absolutely never that. Yeah.
I saw that one of the things CrowdStrike is planning to do, or currently say they are planning to do, who knows how it will shake out, right, in the future, is to stagger deployments of these updates, the rapid response updates, so that they won't take out 8-point-something million computers all in one go. They'll just take out a few 100,000, realize there's a problem, and fix it. Which is better. I mean, it's not, They also plan to fix the content validator that was supposed to validate that the update was actually valid before it pushed the update out that turned out to be invalid. It's ready to see how many times I could say valid in one sentence. So we'll see how it shakes out. There's no easy or good answers right now, but we'll see what we end up with. And yes, it is, of course, all the EU's fault. All right. One last thing, and this really doesn't have a great deal of commentary to go along with it, but in the news last month was yet another flaw in PHP. It's another 9.8 CVSS in PHP, CVE 2024-4577. Which this stood out to me for two reasons. One is it's PHP, which is apparently still hugely popular, who knew, and has a massive install base for many good reasons. It's easy to adopt, easy to code for, and all that good stuff. There's a lot of stuff out there written in PHP. But I thought this one would just disappear because it only affects Windows systems, which is not your average, right? LAMP was always the common stack. And only if you're using Chinese and Japanese language locales, which is, again, further narrowing that subset of PHP systems. But reading about this specifically, and it's being used to deploy remote access Trojans, XMRig, CryptoMiner, which, is the first thing everybody deploys, apparently. Why not mine some crypto? And DDoS botnets, because that's the second thing an attacker always deploys on a compromised system. But it stood out to me because I know that Labs, you have the Sensor Intel series and the DDoS report, right? And there is basically always a PHP CVE in the Sensor Intel series, right? It's sort of ever present. And go on, Malcolm.
Oh, I was going to say, yeah. I mean, the PHP vulnerabilities, there's several that show up on our logs all the time. In fact, just looking at the logs from last month, two notable things stood out. First of all, the CVE that you just mentioned, I believe that was announced. Well, I don't remember the exact day it was announced, but it was announced sometime in June. And the announcement came out, and within hours of the announcement of that vulnerability, we saw scanning hitting our sensors within hours on the very same day, right? Not a huge amount, but definitely present. And so, even though it's a relatively easy to exploit one, in terms of just the attack string used and, so the technical details of it, it's not that hard to pull off. The speed at which it was adopted by the people who are running the scanners that we monitor was to me maybe not surprising, but kind of impressive, right? The other thing too is that just this last month in June, we saw an absolutely massive increase in scanning for a very old PHP vulnerability, CV 2017-9841. And that's actually not a vulnerability in PHP. It's a vulnerability in a piece of software called PHP Unit, which is itself a PHP program. And it's a very straightforward remote code execution kind of vulnerability where if it's deployed incorrectly, you are able to essentially just send a post request with a PHP script. And the amount of scanning, now this has been in our top 10 for a long time. It's always been something that people have been scanning for. But for some reason, the amount of scanning went up in May a bit and then went completely through the roof in June. So we're going to be releasing a new edition of the Sensor Intel series very shortly here. And we're go into a great deal of detail about this vulnerability and about who's scanning for it and about where all the scans are coming from and a number of other things. So, and I have a bunch of speculations about why these things may be, but very little conclusions as to exactly why this is happening. I don't know, David, do you want to say any more about it, or?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And Aaron, if you're good, I'll kind of go into the new DDoS report we've just published. But for anyone watching and not just listening, you'll appreciate maybe the visualization, the Sankey diagram we're showing. And it was interesting, actually, in the DDoS report, and I'll get into that in just a moment. Well, we were tracking a huge amount of traffic just over the past few months. A newer CVE, 2023-1389, that was looking at going after a TP-Link router vulnerability, primarily to subsume vulnerable routers into the Mozzie DDoS botnets, and we've had similar kind of activities from the F5 threat campaign team that have kind of identified exploit attempts against Netgear routers. But this one, this 2017-9841, is absolutely dwarfs all traffic. It's just huge. But again, I suspect, and just as the story with the kind of fed into this, so many of these scans, so many of these vulnerabilities are used to create and expand botnets. In some cases, they have different kind of purposes. They may be crypto miners, but so many of them are running kind of active attacks or DDoS. One of the things I talk about in the DDoS report, actually, certainly when I'm presenting it, and I won't dive into too much details now, but certainly something for future maybe is there was an academic story a few months back where academic researchers from Columbia University were able to create fully autonomous attacking bots using LLMs. And they found that some of the open source models and even ChatGPT weren't particularly effective, but ChatGPT-4, having been trained on 6 hacking manuals and access to curl, Python, and a few other things, could just go and conduct about 75% of attacks completely autonomously, which is crazy. And I kind of mention that because so much of the scanning activity is looking to compromise these devices, primarily for DDoS, but it just kind of sets the mind racing that maybe 6 months, a year in advance, a year from now, we could be looking at botnets that are conducting fully autonomous hacks, not just DDoS, attacks. But I wanted to share with everyone some of the main findings from the DDoS report that we've put out quite recently. So I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about this. And the one thing that we start in the report, actually, if we can kind of share the screen and show people what we're looking at here, is a takedown. So we kind of start with a warning, and some of the good stuff that happened at the end of 2022, start of 2023, was a massive operation by Europol, the FBI, and lots of other agencies across the world that took down 49 stresses, so DDoS as a service, and it had a fairly significant impact. The police law enforcement agencies across the world saw about a 50% reduction in DDoS kind of traffic. Now, those stresses, half of those came back within a few weeks, so they weren't down for long, but the amount of DDoS traffic they were generating was about halved as well. So it seemed like a pretty good sort of sign of things. But what we've seen and what we kind of talk about in the report is, and in many other organizations across the world kind of corroborate this and have been seeing the same thing, is that after a few years of stagnation and even slight decline in DDoS attacks, up to and including 2022, 2023 is a very massive explosion, over doubling the amount of attack traffic from a DDoS perspective that we've seen from previous years. And I just find it interesting because I feel like a lot of organizations, we kind of think that DDoS is a bit of a solved problem. It's almost 30 years old now. Panix was attacked 27 years ago, I think. So it's been around for a long time, but it shows no sign of going away. This is still an evolving and growing threat, new attack vectors, brand new DDoS botnets being kind of created all over the place. Let's go into some of the numbers, though, give you some of the kind of details from the report. So we didn't see the biggest attack that we've ever seen. So a lot of this data we've taken from the F5 distributed cloud service, as well as offering things like bot protection service and so on. We get the DDoS attack logs essentially from that service, and we use it to generate the data science analysis that forms the basis of this report. So we saw a pretty big dip in February, and that kind of aligns, I think, with many of the kind of takedown operations. So there's many reasons that we think we can see a dip there, but that dip is consistent. So January was a little quiet. February was very quiet from a DDoS point of view back in 2023. And that's consistent across all organizations, all regions, all countries across the world, all pretty much saw a significant dip. But then March exploded again. And for us, from a kind of DDoS mitigation point of view, we saw the biggest attack coming in at one point, almost exactly 1 terabit. For anyone, again, kind of looking at the bots whisker plot that I'm showing on screen, fairly consistent attacks throughout the year. One of the questions we wanted to answer was, are DDoS attacks getting bigger? And certainly we see more complex attacks, things like more requests per second, more transactions per second. But from a pure bandwidth point of view, we see modest kind of increase, not necessarily the peak, the biggest attack, but what we have seen, you can look at the kind of the median number of attacks and the 75th percentile. We do see a kind of somewhat increase going from sort of 50 megabits in January to about 900 megabits at the end of the year. So not a kind of clear, certainly not looking explosive exponential growth from a kind of peak bandwidth point of view, but certainly consistently big attacks throughout the whole year. I wanted to break things out. So again, if anyone has the benefit of watching this and not just listening, I've got a plot here, a histogram, which shows the kind of attack frequency of various attack sizes. And the x-axis here is actually logarithmic, so bear that in mind, because what you're seeing towards the middle is that the vast majority of attacks, we do get those 1 terabit attacks, plenty 500 gigabits, but the majority, I think that most organizations are going to suffer, is around about 50 to 200 megabit. So that doesn't sound all that big. Most of us have got home broadband connections with at least 100 megabit these days, if not a terabit in some cases, for some of us lucky ones. But it's interesting, again, because you kind of look at the size and the frequency of these big attacks, and you might think, well, we're unlikely to get a big attack. Is it something to worry about? But as I try and explain in the report, it's kind of rare that it's the peak. It's rare that it's the bandwidth or the size of the attack that's the problem. Commonly, it's the type of attack, what's being used against you, and the target, what are they trying to take down? That's what's usually more complex to worry about, rather than just how much bandwidth they're generating and sending to your IP address. The most common protocol that we saw is no surprise. It's still UDP. It has been for a good number of years. We did actually see an uptick in TCP attacks a few years ago. But last year certainly UDP was kind of king, as it has been for a while. As I'm sure most people are familiar, it's super easy. With the ability to spoof source IP addresses, you can create reflective and what's I'm looking for? Amplified kind of attacks that are very difficult to block. You can't just block the IP address because the IP address is spoofed and it's forged and it can be rotated and changed every time. What we also looked at is typically in the kind of, from a DDoS mitigation point of view, the industry tends to talk about volumetric attacks, those that create a huge amount of bandwidth, the protocol attacks, which typically look to knock out network routers, firewalls, filling up connection tables, sending fragmented or out of order packets, that kind of thing. Or application layer attacks, whether that be trying to attack the HTTP application, the web server, possibly even DNS. And what we've seen is a couple of years ago, we saw a big uptick in application attacks, and they've kind of dropped off somewhat. So we're seeing a fairly even spread, but volumetrics are still taking about 50% of all attacks that we've seen, with the remaining 50% being split almost evenly between those protocol and the application-based attacks. But in terms of specific attack vector, the actual protocol packet that's being sent, again, rewind a couple of years ago, it was very simple UDP floods, volumetric attacks kind of being sent, just saying, with basic UDP packets. Specifically last year, though, massive uptick in what we've referenced here in the charts as UDP DNS queries, effectively DNS NX domain attacks. So creating arbitrary subdomains that DNS primary servers have to resolve, get overwhelmed with queries, and ultimately can't resolve, the legitimate queries from your clients, stop them from getting to the actual web server. So DNS NX queries are almost double the next kind of most common attack method, which is still that UDP package. I mentioned the different types of DDoS attacks, and those application, protocol, and volumetric. I've also talked about the large attacks. So what I did is I tried to break down the frequency of those attacks across the board. And what we found is that although the application layer attacks are far smaller, they're far more numerous in kind of occurrence and frequency, if you like. So again, if we're looking at those kind of small attacks, yes, they're small in bandwidth, but they're far more likely to be application focused, and they are typically far more difficult to block. Actually, that news story we kind of glossed over just before leading into this report spoke a lot about bots. And one thing we talk about in the report is when you're looking at application layer attacks, particularly HTTP ones, you really have to have some way of identifying what a human user is, what a legitimate connection is, and what a bot is. And if you can't do that, you're going to have a really bad time, a really difficult time to actually identify that DDoS traffic and actually block it. We go into as much detail as we can in the report in terms of different sectors, different regions. One of the things we found quite staggering this year was I'd say probably half the sectors that we broke things down to saw a modest growth. Some were fairly flat, some even saw a very small decline. Some sectors saw a huge growth. So banking, financial services, telecoms, software and computer services, and media saw explosive growth. And fixed line, we kind of refer to it as fixed line telecom, but actually refers to all telecommunications industries and ISPs, saw a staggering 655% growth over 2022, which is kind of, astonishing. And banking saw even more. So it's clear that there's some very kind of specific targeted attacks and attack groups out there that have, they know what they're after, and they're going after very specific industries and very specific companies to try and make their point. So what I did, kind of having identified the most attacked organizations and those that were, saw the most explosive growth, was try to figure out if they had any difference in those attack vectors. How were they being attacked differently? And for the most part, they weren't. Telecommunication support services, which I should explain, support services are those organizations that offer things like HR, payroll, and maybe some other financial services to other organizations. So telecoms, support services, software and compute services, which includes cloud, and media were all fairly consistent like most industries. But interestingly, banks and financial services had a very, very different skew. They actually had far more TCP SYN floods than anything else. It's difficult looking at numbers to kind of hypothesize why this is, but I think it's safe to assume that the kind of threat actors were focused and they knew the kind of defenses that many of these organizations had or the ways they could try and take them out, and they were very targeted in terms of either what they were going for or possibly just limited by the stresses and booters they were using to conduct their attacks. We go into loads of detail as much as we can in terms of the different sectors to try and tease out the differences. Sticking with banks and financial services here, I tried to kind of tease out, how do they see those different kind of attacks? What are they being attacked most with? And I mentioned TCP SYN floods, and that kind of maps to some of the other visualizations we've got, where we see for banking and financial services, by far the most numerous kind of targets of attacks are protocol. The graph I've got on screen here for anyone watching is using the MITRE ATT&CK framework. We try and use both in the report to allow people that are familiar with MITRE ATT&CK to try and map that to, or use the terminology they might be familiar with. But again, interesting that it seems that for the most part, as a general rule of thumb, DNS NX domain attacks are by far the most numerous, but it's worth paying attention to where your industry, what your industry is in, what company your industry is in, and whether that makes a difference. And as we quite often say at Labs, it doesn't necessarily matter what the world thinks your industry is. You could be a library. You could be a retailer, but if you offer, say, payment services or something similar, then you may look like a retailer despite being a library, for example. So it really depends how you look like to the attacker rather than what the world really kind of thinks you are from a classification point of view. We also looked at, I was really interested to figure out whether the size of organization made a difference in terms of how likely you were to be attacked. And so what we found was, the way we did this, and there's a number of different ways you could rank and classify organizations in terms of quote unquote size. What I chose to do this year was use the kind of web's top 1 million. So we use the Tranco ranking, and I think it's quite a good list of top 1 million sites. It's a very kind of academic and rigorous scientific approach to the top 1 million. They combine a bunch of different lists to try and remove things like bias and manipulation in the top 1 million. So now F5 Distributed Cloud doesn't have 1 million customers, or they don't have customers as far down as 999,999, but we do have customers down towards 90,000. And for the most part, there is certainly some of the larger organizations facing slightly more frequent attacks, but we still see a consistent number of high number of attacks, kind of regardless of the size. And I think it's interesting. I think it's worth bearing in mind. Again, it's very easy to think from a security point of view, much like insurance, that I'm too small. Who cares about me? I'm not going to be attacked. I'm not big enough. And that doesn't quite map to what we see. It doesn't really matter. There were plenty of reasons, as we'll see in a second, particularly from a kind of geopolitical point of view. The rise of hacktivism is huge. You could happen to have a headquarter or a base in a country for which a group feel passionate about and want to express their opinion. And so it almost doesn't matter who you are. You have to consider all kind of factors to why you might be targeted. We look at kind of regions. We thought it was interesting that perhaps no surprise, that despite North America not being the most attacked region, the USA in particular was the single most attacked country by quite a clear margin, by about 50%. The second most attacked was France. We plot some of the kind of attack frequency throughout the year, so you can see the kind of peaks and troughs. And again, it's interesting to kind of look at those charts and try and map them to events, things that kind of happen on the world stage. France, for example, had a big spike. I think it was March or April of 2023, and it coincided with the French government's announcement of a pension reform plan. And interestingly, an APT came out and publicly stated that they were targeting the French government because of this pension reform ban. I mean, interestingly, it was a Russian-backed group, so not entirely sure of the motivations, but certainly that was their publicly stated claim, is that they were attacking French government institutions because of this policy. For a lot of other countries, it's quite easy to map the kind of peaks and DDoS attacks that you can see in the report to statements, whether it's from President Biden or other countries, professing aid for Ukraine or other kind of political statements very, very soon after we see massive upticks in the number of DDoS attacks. So there's loads more in the report. Hopefully everyone can feel free to go and download it from the website. I mentioned some things, some extra bits in the end, but the one thing I wanted to end on and maybe get everyone's thought on here is some of the new attack vectors that we've had. We've had a whole bunch of new DDoS attack vectors just over the past few months. HTTP2 has unfortunately had a few different kind of vulnerabilities. If you like, there's been loop DOS, DNS bomb. But as I tried to point out, they're not actual vulnerabilities. These are all kind of exploits in the protocol itself. So, attackers have found, some of which have been attacks, DDoS attacks noticed in the wild, some of which thankfully have just been found by academics and researchers. But they are kind of attributes and parts of the protocol designed to implement availability or security, and they've been exploited to create DOS conditions, which I thought was really fascinating. But I'm going to leave it there in terms of, filling everyone's brain with kind of DDoS numbers and stats. We've got the whole report available on the site, which is f5.com/labs.
Thanks, Dave. It's a really cool report. There's a lot. It's very dense with data. you have a ton of good data in there. On that last slide that you had up with the different vulnerabilities that were disclosed in the last sort of year, or rather I should say DOS attack vectors that were disclosed, the two HTTP ones stand out. There was a couple of rice miles there on video, because as MC would say, like HTTP2 and 1.1 is like my specialist subject. those both seem to pose a real world threat, the HTTP2 DOS vectors. The other two that you had, loop DOS and DNS bomb. Loop DOS, to me, it seems like it could be a very powerful thing, but it's quite narrow in where you could actually exploit it. I think it's probably more of a theoretical thing. And also, for anybody unfamiliar, the concept is that if you have two services you have two systems that are running the same UDP-based service that both use well-known port numbers to communicate, you could maybe coerce them into basically talking to each other forever by spoofing a packet as if it came from system A, and make system A and B just talk to each other as fast as they can forever. When that came out, I read that research, and A, it was like, how did we not talk about this before? And B, it's a bit of a, well, duh. It's like, what the long and short of it is, UDP is susceptible to IP spoofing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, duh.
Yeah.
Like, that's kind of its reason for existing. Is that it doesn't do a three-way handshake, and you just spit packets out and hope that.
And we're going that way more and more, right? I mean, HTTP3 will be UDP. So it's interesting that it feels like, to me at least, maybe from an A point of view, we're just going more and more and more to UDP across the spectrum.
We're chasing ever more speed, I think, is the reason for that, right? And removing the overheads of TCP, and also because the infrastructure between endpoints has become so much more resilient and fast in the last 20 years, right? Like you say, we have connections at home. I have a gigabit down and a gigabit up. There was the stuff of dreams 10 years ago, let alone 20 years ago.
Oh, yeah.
So that's that will be, I happen to know that Aubrey is stuck slumming it with 11 meg up. The poor guy. And the last one that you had, sorry, Malcolm.
Oh, I was just going to say, I mean, the conceptually, the loop DOS thing is pretty interesting. And there's a lot of different places where that similar concept can be applied. I remember reading a story about a guy who was angry with some company, I don't know, that had a automatic ticketing system. So whenever you submitted an email, a ticket was created. And so he essentially created an autoresponder on his end that whenever he got a notification of a ticket being created, it would then send another email to create another ticket, back and forth. And nobody seemed to notice it, but he generated something like several million tickets on the other end, right? So, I mean, I don't know. It's a fascinating thing, but I agree with you, Aaron. I'm not entirely sure how feasible it is in general, but sort of conceptually, I bet there's other places and other ways where you can stimulate a response that can put something into a loop like this. Oh, yeah. So maybe we'll see better, more applicable ways of using it, right?
Yeah, I mean, we had to take a long, hard look at our own products to make sure that none of the internal services that communicate via UDP were susceptible to the same approach. Yeah. They weren't the common protocols that were talked about in the research, but yeah, it applies to any UDP service, potentially. The email thing, we had the same thing happen with our own shared mailbox in the F5 cert quite a while back now. I remember someone's ticketing system they'd signed their ticketing system up to our mailbox, and it got stuck in a to and fro loop. We sent an email. It sent us an email saying, we've created a ticket. That caused us or our autoresponder to respond back to it, which caused their ticketing system to open another ticket. Rinse and repeat until someone noticed. Yeah. And just lastly, DNS bomb, that one, if anybody listening hasn't read about DNS bomb, I encourage you to go and read it. It's technically quite dense and hard to pass, I would say. But it's a really interesting technique that is actually novel. Basically, you are like parceling up DNS requests and then waiting for them to go off and cripple a system. That's an interesting piece of research.
Yeah.
But with that, we are basically out of time, unless, sorry, MZ, I kind of cut you off.
That's good. No, I was just going to say on the HTTP2 side, we're seeing, I think, a lot of those coming through. Whenever we say HTTP, everyone's like, oh, web pages. But everything, like HTTP is the new TCP, right? Like it's everything is built on top of HTTP these days. It seems like every new service product, whatever that comes out, is leveraging HTTP as a transport, which is one of the reasons also why like things are moving towards the direction of QUIC with HTTP3, because everything's riding on top of it. So latency and speed is becoming more and more important. And so we're seeing a lot of attention paid to HTTP because it's not just compromising web pages anymore. There's a lot of stuff out there that uses that protocol.
Oh, absolutely. Every mobile app is really just is pretending to be, a web browser and a web server in the background. All right, cool. With that, I think we are pretty much out of time. Even though we could talk endlessly about all of the news that happened in the last month, I am sure. So thank you to MZ, especially for being the +1 on this episode.
Thanks,
and Malcolm, it's good to have you back after a couple of months. I don't think you've been able to join us. And Dave, as always, it's great to have you back. Dave, as always, thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Aaron.
And we will see everybody next month for another episode of ABSC Monthly.
Thanks for checking out ABSC Monthly, a DevCentral podcast. We hope you enjoyed it. And if so, please consider clicking like, subscribing, or even writing a review. Don't forget to check us out next month and every month. Available on all major podcast platforms, as well as YouTube. We'll see you next month.